Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay Nielsen. I'm the Eco University Director over at Eco Engineers, and we're happy to have you today on our webinar, Decoding Carbon Removal Methodologies. I want to introduce our speakers. Today, you'll be hearing from Roxby Hartley, David LaGreca, and Michael Welch. They're all very heavily involved in voluntary carbon markets and our methodology creation team here at Eco Engineers. Roxby is the climate risk director. David LaGreca handles all of our voluntary carbon market services, and Michael Welch is on our operations side, kind of doing the work for all of our services there in the voluntary carbon markets. So we're happy you're here today. We will have a live Q&A at the end of the presentation, and let's get started with a video.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Lindsay, and thank you to everybody for joining us on this webinar. I'm really lucky to work with David and Michael, who are brilliant at turning carbon removal innovative ideas into impactful projects. How do you do that? Well, you have to develop a certain set of documents and processes. Key to that is developing a methodology. And I'm going to hand over to David and Michael to explain how that works.
Thanks for that, Roxby. I appreciate the intro there. We really need to identify the pathway from innovation to action, and we do that in the confines of project development by developing a methodology. A methodology is the cookbook, the exact process that you will follow to make a legitimate crediting claim in the carbon markets. Methodology is required to be very project specific. You can't have a general methodology to apply to all things carbon or to get a credit for every type of activity. It's got to be very specific so it can be replicable and duplicated both by other project developers as well as by verifiers.
Yeah, and you want to make sure that you consider issues like, as it says here, double counting, but you'll hear lots of terms like additionality and permanence and boundaries, and these are all kind of defined for a project within its methodology.
Yeah, and you don't want to necessarily just break the books every time. Where it's possible, it's good to use existing standards or to build on practices that have been solidified and legitimized through time in the carbon markets. And most importantly, the methodology's got to be actionable and auditable. It's got to be something that can be followed and subsequently be checked by an independent auditor for validity.
Yeah, and something that even a third party could come in and start a new project and follow through the steps that are laid out and have their results be equally viable.
So in these markets, there's a lot of misconceptions about what a methodology is, what it is not. First off, there's a lot of synonyms that are used for methodology and a lot of ideas about what somebody has when they've written their ideas down on a piece of paper. A methodology is not just a life cycle assessment. A life cycle assessment is a very particular type of carbon accounting program encompassing cradle to grave or cradle to cradle, a very broad spectrum of boundaries for assessing emissions impacts. They're also not infinitely flexible. Similar to what we said before, methodologies have to be specific to a particular project type, and they are required to follow particular scientific and industry sector approaches.
Yeah, and they're not only a marketing piece either. They are a tool for a project to follow and ultimately develop the credits. So it's more of an instruction booklet, although we've seen in the recent past that they are valuable for marketing and they can gain a lot of attention. That isn't their ultimate purpose.
And they also don't operate in and of themselves outside of all standardized principles. So we've seen the release of the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. Recently, we've also seen European Commission has frameworks, as well as existing registries have strong principles in conjunction with the ISO standard. So you have to layer each one of these into a coherent approach, which ticks all the boxes of integrity and quality while also catering it to your own project idea.
So why would you develop a methodology? Well, I mean, as we've kind of talked about in the previous two slides, there are PR aspects to it. It's a good way to demonstrate that you're looking to create something that has high integrity, that follows existing standards, and is trying to make a real difference in the world as an impact to climate change. Do you also use it for kind of standing out to your competitors, showing that you mean what you're saying, you're going to walk the talk? It also helps when you're seeking investment from third parties. A methodology shows that you're far along in the development of your idea and processes, and that you're really putting yourself out there to be available and reviewed by third-party reviewers through the verification validation process.
And you don't develop a methodology just because you want to. If you're following an approach that's already been well-trodden in the markets, or your own innovation within an established framework, that's not the reason to develop a new methodology. A methodology is to accurately credit for innovative new ideas, and then to pave the way for others to follow suit. It does allow for your investors to fully comprehend that you have a pathway to market, but it does maybe first and foremost provide a level of transparency for how and why you deem your credit generation pathway to be viable and reasonable within the credits and carbon accounting space. It also gives you a pathway through to meeting all the voluntary carbon market requirements that are out there. There's the Integrity Council, ISO, there's individual buyer standards. Half the corporations who are buying carbon dioxide removal credits have their own frameworks, and the methodology is to be tailored to the best approaches out there on the market. And this is the pathway to succeeding in that approach. There's a very broad network of registries out there. This is just a smattering of some of them that are showing up with prominence. Through time, the Verified Carbon Registry Verified Carbon Standard has registered the most number of credits throughout history. The big four are deemed Verified Carbon Standard, American Carbon Registry, Climate Action Reserve, Gold Standard, but these have been slower on the uptake for carbon dioxide removal approaches, such as those highlighted by Isometric, Covalent, and some of the newer registries like C-Capsule.
There's a wide array of different carbon dioxide removal project types out there. This is just a small list, but they all have a similar goal, which is to take down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and have it stored away for a sizable period of time. Typically in the market, they've been looking to at least 100 years, but now we're kind of edging that forward, and people are looking more for projects that are on the 1,000-year scale to make a real substantial impact in the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and thus reduce the overall impact of climate change on people around the world.
It's interesting as well, because some of these methodologies or some of these project types are fairly well understood, but some of them are really on the cutting edge of science. And that leads us nicely into our next slide, I think, which is What do we do when we want to develop a CDR project? The first thing we take on is a scientific review. It's not necessarily on all projects, but we want to make sure that the project has good basis in in science. We have to understand the project idea and its implications, not only in how the chemistry or the physics work for the carbon removal itself, but the broad implications for the environment. None of these projects happen in isolation. We use client data, but we do an independent literature review. And we look for categories and degrees of risk, particularly around ecological harm, social implications, and how a project might scale. Ecological harm can be everything from releasing toxins to releasing greenhouse gases unintentionally. And at the end, we summarize these risks, and we look for applicability of the existing methodologies or standards to the project. I think that's our first step. We want to understand that the CDR is scientifically well-based.
And the next step is going to be to get the formations of the idea down on paper. The formations of what will become your crediting methodology. This can be done very well through a proto-protocol, which is really just the skeletal outline of what will become the final protocol or methodology. It will outline the necessary components within a complete methodology to identify how we're going to address those risks identified in our scientific feasibility study, and to really draw out the plan for crediting. A white paper is very similar to a proto-protocol. However, it does have a bit more of a marketing twinge to it. So it'll be as much directed at identifying the risk areas as it will be at explaining the concept and justifying the likely integrity of a final methodology once it's described. So it incorporates all of the MRV components, or monitoring, reporting, verification components and requirements for an eventual deployment of a full-scale methodology. These are frequently used for marketing and fundraising purposes, but properly developed, they flow very well from the scientific feasibility study into full methodology development, and can be an integral part of a methodology development process.
Yeah, so I mean, that brings us to development of the methodology, and there's a lot of considerations that you need to be aware of when going down this path. That's why in the earlier step of the scientific review, we try to identify if there are any existing registries that already have methodologies for this project type, because it is a timely process. You have to create a timeline for your project, your methodology development, and that can take upwards of 6 to 6 months easily, and in some cases it's taken a lot longer, depending on how far your project has developed the science underlying it. We're already equipped with our summary description of the methodology if we've done a proto-protocol or a white paper. So those feed in, as David was saying. We have to make sure we identify the appropriate applicability conditions so that another person or your verifier can come in, see what a project that would be compliant under this methodology would have, what type of aspects define this type of project. You've got project boundary, where you define what you're measuring. Everything inside the boundary is what's measured. Stuff that is outside is not included in your calculations. Usually you have a baseline, which is the determination of what would have happened if the project didn't come online, and usually that's what you measure against. There's additionality considerations, and that's throughout all the voluntary carbon market, not just within CDR, but avoidance as well. And that is, would this project have happened without the benefit of being able to sell carbon credits on the carbon market? Permanence, we've already mentioned a little bit. We want to make sure that when you capture that CO2, it stays sequestered away. It's not going anywhere. And we're talking on the order of 100 to 1,000 years at least. Leakage is a term that's not well understood by a lot of people. It's not, as many want to say, carbon leaking out of your pipelines, or spilling from what you've captured. Leakage in the case of the methodologies is unintended emissions that happen outside of your project boundary. So if you're using a lot of electricity and that requires the electrical grid to bring more electricity online, and maybe they have a coal plant, or they're using diesel peaker plants or something, that has a lot of negative impacts on the climate as a whole, and you want to be able to account for those. So then we get to the very meat of the methodology, which is quantification. How you measure, how you calculate the total number of credits you create, what the detailed measurements steps are, and how you get from measurement to validation. And you want to always make sure that you follow kind of the general principles of this, which is you don't want to cause more environmental or social harm. And so any good methodology should kind of take this into account, whether through stakeholder engagement or other measurements and factors that are considered. So coming into your project development and registration, now that you've got your methodology, you can start writing down and defining how your project fits into the methodology as described by the applicability conditions, and it meets all the requirements of additionality and so on. You have you can put together your compliance monitoring plan. So you've got a really well-defined method of measuring the emissions inputs that you have. So transportation inputs and everything, and ultimately the carbon removed and the net carbon benefit to the atmosphere. And then you put this all together in your project design document. Your PDD serves as the public face of your whole process of getting from project concept to credit development. And this is a public facing document that, if you're with a major registry, it would be posted on their website, and anyone can come in and read about your project, see how it's impacting the environment as a whole, what the benefits are. There's a lot of back and forth on using the term storage versus sequestration. Generally, they're synonymous. A lot of people will use sequestration because they like the idea of how it gives that extra feel of being completely sealed off and stored away for as nearly forever. And this once you've got all this documentation put together, you have a blueprint for your auditors during the verification validation process, so that they can come through and they have something to compare to first to the methodology to make sure your project follows all of the requirements within that, but then also the credits and the calculations you've done to create those credits can have this PDD document that they can compare it to. So there's a transparent process going across this whole step that allows you to create those credits and make sure and show everyone that they're real and tangible, and they're based on what's happened with your product and in the environment.
The most well-known phase of this whole process is oftentimes used synonymously with this entire program we're discussing is the validation and verification phase of project development. Once you've had your whole process identified and drawn out through the methodology development process before this, you generate that project design document to reflect in almost a mirror image the way your methodology was drafted, to prove out every one of the components within it. And then in the subsequent step will be to have an independent third party validate, which is confirming your project actually adheres to that methodology, and then to verify that the claims made are consistent with the required approach and with industry standards. The majority of the time, the validation verification process is once again conducted according to an ISO process. ISO 14064 series has requirements for validation and verification, and this is an integral component of a successful project. Because if it's not checked by a third party, then one is self-auditing and self-claiming and calls into question the legitimacy of the entire program of crediting.
David, I have a question for you on validation and verification. How is that timed for credit generation? When can somebody sell credits? Does it have to does verification have to happen before, or can it be after credits are generated and sold?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And in the carbon dioxide removal market, there is a push for both, partially because of the technologies are new and innovative, and it does take a matter of months to actually go through this entire process, let alone the technology development phase of starting up a new carbon business. So historical and best practice is to have credits issued upon in an ex post fashion after they've been generated and the world's atmosphere has been finally benefited and then confirmed by an independent auditor. The ex ante crediting is relatively unique to CDR and is a forward crediting approach. Puro has pre-corks, for instance, that represent this process. Covalent has a similar ideal for presenting new ideas to the marketplace. But in either case, there should be a confirmation that those credits have legitimacy prior to making a public claim.
Right, I see. And so for credit generation, it's really the end stage of the project. And you'll end up with a serialized credit indicating the total volume of greenhouse gases removed, and that can be sold into the voluntary markets either over the counter or through a registry, and you can sell them monthly or quarterly or annually depending on how that slots into the verification timeline, and how those credits are generated is completely described in the PDD and how the reporting is going to happen. And that's why it's so important to have your PDD reviewed as well as your reports by independent third parties. So what do we do at Eco Engineers? It's an interesting company. It's a very exciting place to work. We have three main activities. We consult, we audit, and we have Eco University. And Lindsay, who put together this presentation, runs the Eco University program. We're a team of engineers. We have multiple scientists. We have got some very good auditors and researchers who are all very passionate about the work that we do. We're all trying to drive to the same goal, which is to make our clients' projects work and to draw down carbon dioxide at the same time. We work in this intersection of science, regulation, and carbon markets. Very deep knowledge across the company in all sorts of different sectors, and we feel that we're very good at helping our clients navigate how they can develop their projects and be successful in this disruptive and ever-changing world.
And developing methodologies with our clients is an integral step. It's a very important component of our offerings at Eco Engineers to facilitate the smooth transition of corporations to net zero and to draw finance into the carbon dioxide removal space.
And with that, let's go to questions and answers.
everybody was talking about traditional offset projects, and now they're talking about CDR methodology. What is the big difference, and what are the differences between those offset projects versus the CDR, what we're talking about today?
I'm glad to take that one. So I would say the difference is there's no fundamental difference. The fundamental difference is going to be in the project accounting phase, but the actual applicable differences between how we're going to go about that are largely the same. We're going to follow the same high quality, slow rolling, but methodical process towards establishing a crediting process. CDR has some particular issues when it comes to, I guess offsets have a particular issue when it comes to additionality, establishing baselines. It's a different process to get there, but at the end of the day, we're going to follow the same orderly operation to achieve a crediting approach.
Fantastic. And you mentioned additionality. There is a question about that. What does it mean that VCM credits cannot be added to other credits, such as the Inflation Reduction Act's 45Q, or even other credits in the business, such as the LCFS or biomethane sale? Can you comment a little bit on the additionality there?
I'm happy to take that one. It depends on how those. It really crosses over to what the carbon accounting is. It's really two questions there. If you're already selling credits for carbon, then you shouldn't be also taking part in the LCFS program. Say if you've got a CCS project attached to an ethanol plant, you can either embed the carbon credits into the fuel or you can sell them separately into the VCM, but you can't do both. But that same ethanol plant can take the 45Q as a benefit as well. It depends on the financial additionality of what the costs are for the project and how much would that cost to go forward. Do you want to add to that, guys? I know you have more to say on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you explained it pretty well, Roxby. Again, it's the goal of the voluntary carbon market is to try to promote new projects rather than try to find more revenue sources for existing projects, and that's why there's usually a short look back period. You can't have a project that's been operating for 5 years and go and then suddenly start selling credits. So I mean, the additionality is usually a multi-phase process to determine, you know, if this project is something that's new and having an additive impact on emissions, whether that's for removals, you know, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, or if it's avoidance, the amount of carbon that's being emitted to the atmosphere. But all in all, it's just trying to keep use the market as a tool to move things forward and minimize and constantly improve the emissions levels globally.
Thanks, guys. There's a question here about what is the minimum amount of investment that we should put into these projects that is worth it? And I think that's a little bit of a scalability question, David.
Sure, yeah. So scalability is a major question with carbon dioxide removal, because a lot of the projects in the removal space are in their infancy. So the amount of tons per year right now is orders of magnitude smaller than it is in existing avoidance and offset project types. So, you know, for instance, some of the world's largest direct air capture plants are going to aspirationally capture 10,000 tons a year over the next couple of years in pilot plants, and there's many other examples in that same kind of scale range. The carbon dioxide removal space right now is a game of potential. It's really about where we can go as a species in a revolutionary reindustrialization approach to approach our historical emissions versus avoiding new emissions, and that's kind of the promise of CDR in a nutshell. And so, is there a minimum tons per year? Probably. Like, there's probably some project types out there that are not going to be viable going forward, and we're not really here to pick winners and losers. We just assess from our standpoint the opportunities that have highest environmental integrity, and don't assume it's a zero-sum game. Project finance into into fighting climate change is really in all of our benefit. So we're not here to take money from one and put it in another source.
Yeah, I think, and on top of that, to just take it a step further, if you're looking for what a minimum amount, that would be determined by the project itself. Both the scalability that David said, but also, you have to look at the viability of the technology. Are you removing more carbon from the atmosphere than you're emitting in doing that removal? And then you have to look at how much more and what makes the financial sense for that project type.
Right.
There's also many questions. Oh, sorry, Roxby, go ahead.
I was just going to add that on CDR projects, we're crossing over into geoengineering, and we want to be extremely careful about what the limits are for each of the processes for the environment.
Great. Going into a little bit about the money, some project developers said that it would be good to have an indication of the prices of these VCM credits to see how they could support new projects. Is there anywhere they can look for that, or how would you suggest they get an indication of these values to see if their project is worthwhile?
Well, there's an effort within eco-engineers to start putting together some of that data and putting it out on a monthly basis. I guess you'll hear more of that if you subscribed to our news feeds. There are other sources out there that you can look around for, but I'll plug us. Roxby is definitely working on getting those numbers and figuring out how to make it so that it's on a regular basis, and it'll give you some averages, and not definitive based on, because each project type is a little different in how it's marketable, but you'll have some kind of idea of averages.
I would add that there's some really good sources from industry groups. CDR.FYI is a really good source for everybody to look at for kind of the scalability question as well as pricing. And it's also good to know in voluntary carbon markets that prices are incredibly friable. They change daily and weekly based off of publicity and based off of viability and based off of supply and demand. So there's, what you see today might not be the case when you actually deploy your project in 1 to 5 years. But yeah, that pricing indications is as good as you can get in this market. So take what you can get.
There's a question here. I think it's pretty interesting. They'd like to hear more about the 100-year versus 1,000-year permanence comment. Are there any legal or other hurdles for the 1,000 years compared to 100? It seems impossible to fathom something being stored for that long.
You can have permanence extending tens of thousands of million years depending on what you're converting the carbon dioxide into. It just depends, really. There's a huge range of variation in the ability of different environments or different structures to contain CO2.
And as far as regulatory hurdles, some programs define the minimum permanence period. Certain registries have their own minimum permanence period, and those vary. So as far as like hurdles to get there, it's proving based off historical, geological, and other kind of precedents, as well as adding modeling to the circulation systems of the oceans or circulation systems or geologic Earth systems. So being able to define those periods is somewhat arbitrary, but it's based off of modeling, best available science, and at times it has to be geologically stored. So in a saline aquifer, Class 6 permits in the U.S., for instance, have very particular permanence periods. It's project specific, though.
Question here about the registries. What is the largest certification company for CO2 emissions in the U.S.? I know we listed a bunch out there, but I mean, what are the few that we should be looking at?
Are you discussing registries or companies?
Certification company for CO2 emissions.
So there's very large verifiers would be a certification company. As far as registries is where the credits go to actually be serialized and issued. And in the United States and globally, we mentioned verified carbon standard historically. I believe in the carbon dioxide removal space, off registry is winning right now. So not tied to any particular registry, but being registered or being purchased from groups like Frontier, Stripe, Shopify, Microsoft, and then probably my estimate would be Puro Earth would be the largest registry after that, and Carbon Future is up there as well, though not by definition a registry.
Should an environmental impact assessment be a part of a requirement methodology? It's kind of a three-parter. Or is the methodology strictly for carbon accounting? And then who holds the responsibility for the environmental impact?
So most, a good methodology is, I think we might have noted in the presentation, should include some sort of clause about doing no additional harm to the environment. Environmental impact assessment is a good step for that, for determining what that impact might be, and then figuring out how it should be mitigated. And different methodologies will have different levels of that type of determination that need to be made. But there should, it's incumbent upon the developer to kind of follow that basic tenet of do no additional harm. A lot of, if you go with the gold standard, they will, as a registry, they have additional focus on looking at the sustainability goals, and those also are looking at co-benefits and how you can improve. And any of yours, because this is kind of a free form market, when, as David said, a lot of changing prices and everything, the projects that do better with the environment will fetch higher prices on the market and will get more attention. If you're a project that is found to be doing harm or having negative impacts on the environment, you're going to have a much harder time selling your credits, and when you do, you're not going to be getting top dollar for them.
Yeah, we don't want to be myopic on carbon dioxide in project development, because there's obviously multiple implications and other ramifications of developing any type of project. So it's really the responsibility of the community to the CDR and the carbon crediting community more broadly to account for those kind of emissions and try to capture as many sustainable development goals as possible in conjunction with the rapid pace of scalability that we're all desiring.
I have a couple questions here on validation verification. One of them is, why does the project design document also need to be independently verified if the methodology itself is?
They meet different goals. The methodology is the blueprint for how you build a house, and then the PDD is the actual construction of the house. And you really want to make sure your plans meet the specification and the actual build of your plans meet the specification.
I like that analogy. For independent third-party validation or verification, does it include sending samples out for analysis to verify the analytical measurements that are being used for the carbon account, that the carbon accounting is accurate? Is it physical samples, or how is that done?
Typically, you will,
project.
Yeah, it depends on the project, but typically you will ask that any lab samples or any materials are independently audited from a different laboratory, and part of the QC or the verification will be make sure that the laboratory that's being used is meeting good QC guidelines So you have two ways of verifying that the data you're getting are correct without actually sending samples out.
Here's the
A good
ultimate
methodology
question.
will have that in it. A good PDD or methodology will describe exactly how you're going to meet the standards of the calibration standards for any measurements that you're going to make.
Can you explain just really quickly the difference between the PDD and the actual MRV methodology? Well, I guess you already did. It's the house versus it's construction versus like.
Yeah, the MRV is kind of part of the MRV is part of both. There's a description of how it's going to be done in the methodology, and then the implementation of that in the PDD.
Yeah, so there's kind of 3 steps there. So there's a methodology, which you may be the developer of it. You may have adopted one from the existing marketplace. The step 2 will be your mirror image reflecting document, which is the project design document saying this is how our project is designed to be implemented. The 3rd step is going to be your actual monitoring plan, which is to be audited on a regular basis, consistent with the methodology requirements. So there's kind of that, and that's the piece that changes every year. Your monitoring plan will be modified on a regular basis to reflect the changing conditions and the actual credit generation assertion that you're making for your project.
Fantastic. We're coming up on time here. Do you guys have any other parting words? Any other anything you want to say to the audience regarding CDR and eco-engineers and how we might be able to help?
I would say that we have,
we're all hesitant. You put on the spot there, Lindsay.
I'd say that we've got a really good program deriving from working on at least 8 methodologies at this particular moment in time at various stages of development. We've released some publicly, and we've released white papers publicly, and we are kind of churning through these as well as we can. It's a very iterative process, and at Eco Engineers, we're really trying to keep up with science and keep up with all of you out there who are innovating faster than any registry or any marketplace can handle. So bring it on. We want to help you. We want to help you manifest these good ideas.
That seems as good a time as any. So for those of you that are still with us, did you have something, Michael?
No, I was just
no, that was
thumbs
good.
up to David.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.